put that together and create a framework for the next generation of sports scientists. Because I was one of the first starting off in rugby and soccer, one of the first to come here. And it has changed over the years. And I'm going to start with this guy. This is Hans Christian Andersen. I come to an analytics conference and start talking about fairy tales. But many of his fairy tales have been turned into movies by Disney. And one of the fairy tales that he's most well known for are The Emperor's New Clothes. So the story goes that this emperor was approached by two weavers, dressmakers, tailors. And they told him that they could make for him the most fabulous robes and garments that had been seen. But they told him that they were magic. There was something special about these garments. They would only be seen by staff who were competent, who were not stupid, and who were very capable. The emperor thought this was a wonderful idea. Not only do I get the most magnificent robes, but I get to see if my staff, if my princes, if my subjects are loyal and smart. So the weavers came and asked him to pose in all these different ways, measured him, and spent days and days measuring him. Weeks passed, and then they eventually arrived with these garments, these robes. And they dressed the emperor. There was only one small problem. The emperor couldn't see the garments himself. But like all good leaders, he ignored that, and he asked his subjects, how did he look? Asked his princes, asked all his loyal subjects, how did he look? And what do you think all of them told him? He looked magnificent. They were the best robes they'd ever seen. He looked fabulous. So the emperor was very proud of himself. He couldn't see them, but he was a wonderful judge of character. He had really smart, loyal subjects, princes. And then he decided, his ego growing, that he would parade through his city. And everything went well until a small girl shouted out, "The emperor is naked." Sports science, if we're really honest, sports science and analytics, if we're really honest, has a similar story. There have been many things promised about sports science. There have been many wonderful stories written about its impact, but in reality, its impact on the scoreboard has been minimal. And there are some key issues that have held that back. We have an opportunity to impact the scoreboard in a far, far greater way by adopting and looking at this from a global perspective, moving away from the reductionist approach of trying to solve small pieces and stepping back and looking at this as a bigger problem. So I've never had the opportunity to break up with 200 people, but if you ever do, it sounds a little bit like this. Understand, it is not your problem, okay? It's my problem. It's not your problem. Sports science and analytics have some very, very bright people, and they do some wonderful things. You've got GPS, heart rate variability, but it's akin to firing a cannon from a canoe. If the basis and the model is not sound, if that is not addressed first, it doesn't matter what the technology is. It doesn't matter whether you're arguing over regression analysis or neural networks. It doesn't matter if you're arguing over heart rate variability, GPS, biochemistry. This doesn't matter if the fundamental model on which it is based is not correct. Having worked in teams across, like I said, across Europe, Australia, and the US, the manner in which sports science and analytics is most effective depends on the model that is created. So the way that I was taught it, and this is the term I use, is a game model. The game model is used in Europe primarily, but the game model is the model by which we use to explain the game. How do we play the game as a team, as an organization? Because everybody views it differently, and if there is not one holistic model that we can all communicate with, then we're all speaking different languages. Let me give you a very, very simple example. And this happens very frequently in sport. What you have is you have different coaches. You've got an offensive coach, head coach, strength coach, nutritionist. You've got so many different people, and they watch a game. There's a fundamental error made. The head coach will say about perhaps a defensive tackle or a defensive end, he's slow. Position coach will say he needs fast feet. Strength coach will say he needs starting strength. Somebody else might say, well, he's not agile enough. They're all describing the same thing, but they're all using a different language. They're using different words. The importance of a game model is to give everybody a unified language and a unified model by which they describe what is happening. And this is not simply about language, but it's about moments in the game. It's about principles of the game. And having that model, then we can build our sports science. Then we can build our analysis. Then we have moments. Then we have context for everything that we do. The other issue is that with much of the data that we collect, if we don't have a model for it, if we don't have a language, if we don't have a moment for it, we can't provide context. So all that we're collecting is data, and unless that context is universal, unless that context is understood by each of the different departments, it can't transfer. So the reductionist approach that we end up with, studying small segments of performance, can't translate, and we struggle to communicate. One of the challenges we have is what I refer to as backroom bandwidth. You have coaches and players, and in the middle, you've got these wonderfully, extremely well-educated masters and PhDs, and there's a communication issue. Having that model eliminates that. It gives us a model by which we can communicate. When you work across different sports, you see this a lot clearer. You understand that the impact of the physical qualities, the ones that are easiest to measure, GPS, heart rate, all those things, have a smaller impact in certain games. They influence the outcome of a game in soccer to a far lesser degree than they do in basketball or in football. Why is that important? That determines how much time and how much investment we need to spend. It also suggests where we can learn the most. If we want to improve our team tactically and technically, it's best study those sports. But you wouldn't go to a soccer team to understand and learn more about strength and conditioning. And these are very, very important perspectives to have as we continue to try and improve our players. The other thing that is very important is as we understand the different categories that influence performance, we understand better that our older players, their performance will decline, but they can compensate, and they compensate better with improvements in psychology, their concentration, their confidence, their experience, as well as tactical and technical development. But this is a holistic model. The player's performance may stay the same, but how they compensate from one to the other is very, very important. That model allows us then to decide what we want to measure. By measuring the player across these four coactives, because they work together, now we can understand the ratio between different players. So you can have different players achieving the same or higher levels of performance, but they rely on different areas. So you can take a Cam Newton, for example. A younger player at this point in time achieves a very, very high level, but he relies primarily on his physical qualities. He relies on certainly tactically and technically very good, but then you've got a more cerebral player, older player, who can rely less on his physical qualities, but relies more on his experience, like a Tom Brady or previously Peyton Manning. Understanding this is very, very important for drafting, free agency, and understanding our roster as well, because it allows us prioritize the time. What sometimes we fail to remember is there is a limited amount of time, there is a limited amount of stress that we can put on an athlete. Understanding how to optimize that by profiling our players allows us to keep them healthy. We cannot just simply keep adding load on top of load, because then you end up with a fatigued player. If a player's performance is suffering, you can't ask the psychologist to work on him, the strength coach to work on him, the therapist to work on him, the offensive coordinator. You can't have all these people working on him, because he's just going to get more tired and more stressed. So it's about the optimization of resources. It's about the allocation of the resources that we have available. Many of you have heard the analogy of the 5 blind men around an elephant. You've got one guy who puts his arm around a leg and thinks he has a tree trunk. Somebody else is holding on to an ear, thinks he has a flag. Somebody else has a tail. Somebody else has the trunk. But nobody has the full picture. Yet they're all touching the very same thing. And what has happened in sports science, what has happened in performance to date is that arguably our greatest strength has become our greatest weakness. Sports science largely, not in all cases, but largely focuses on the physical attributes of performance. And they focus them on in isolation, not in a holistic model, not in the context of health, tactical, technical, psychological. And we can measure all of these things very, very easily. Never before have we been able to measure movement, sweat, blood, everything. Sleep. It's so invasive now, arguably too invasive. But never before have we been able to focus on the physical qualities. At the elite end in sport, these are the least important. The players who make it to the elite level, whether it's professional and arguably college, are physically very capable. And we can improve them, and we can identify limiting factors. However, the tactical, technical, and psychological elements, if they are not observed, assessed, monitored, or tracked, very often they are the limiting factor. And the investment in sports science that only looks at the physical qualities is not the optimum use of resources across the board. Some of the best soccer teams, some of the best football teams run less, cover less distance, are not as strong, are not as fast globally. However, going back to the model, in specific moments, in specific contexts, then they are. And it's being able to relate back to the game model, that 3D model that we all communicate with. One of the challenges as well that we have is that backroom teams have started to grow over time. And we have, for example, you've got a strength department, you've got an athletic training department. In some cases, if they can't communicate or can't get on, now you've got a rehab department. You've got psychologists, you've got nutritionists, you've got backroom teams grow. I remember years ago it's not a new phenomenon, I was with Bolton Wanderers. We went to play Arsenal, and we went down on the train, and when we got off, we had 2 buses. We had 16 players and 18 staff. And that's, I don't know how many years ago that is. Arsenal drove up with 1 bus, and I think there were only 3 backroom people. But nowadays, it's even greater. I think as a college team, we have 5 buses, with some pro teams have 7 buses. And it's not all players. It's largely staff. Not necessarily a bad thing, but remember that all of these people, all of these departments need communication. They all have separate silos, and they all need to be able to communicate across the board. Otherwise, you end up with too many egos, too many departments, and unless that model, unless that universal language is shared, communication suffers. So, what's the solution? The solution is that we have very complex problems when we're trying to improve them, and they need to be solved in a clustered approach using not interdisciplinary, not but multidisciplinary teams. Taking your 5 blind men around an elephant, they all need to be present. They all need to be present when solving the different problems. If a player fumbles a ball, everybody needs to be aware of how we solve that problem and also what the solution is, because it's not simply about applying maximum resources to this problem. It's about optimizing what we have so that we can solve the different problems. One of the mistakes that we have made in sport as well is we have simply applied, or we simply have resorted to applying or creating roles rather than distributing responsibilities. And one of the failings that we've had is we've tried to go from 0 to 60 too fast. One of the first things that needs to be put in place in any team, any organization trying to build or develop a sports science model is a pathway. How do they do it, and how do they develop it over a period of time? You can't simply just employ people in certain elements, in certain areas, and expect it to take off. There has to be a pathway in place so that they can optimize. And the first stage is to upskill the staff so they're aware of how they can exploit it best. But again, it all comes back to a game model and a cohesion so that the staff understand what they're trying to achieve and using the same language. This is particularly important when it comes to rehabilitation, because the handover between departments and the return to play can be speeded up and can be sped up if the same departments use that same language that the coaches use. Having coaches involved in the rehabilitation in the rehabilitation stages is critical as well, because it means that that return to play is not a segmented staging, but it's a gradual reintroduction to optimal performance. So the player returns to performance, not returns to play, but returns to their performance faster, which is usually the delayed stage. So you hear of players who come back to perform, but they're not able to get up to game speed. If the coaches are involved early on at that stage and understand the model and understand the context, that return to play is much faster. So, in conclusion, the first stage with professional teams, the first stage with elite teams, is to upskill the staff initially, not to suddenly explode in size and upsize. The focus has to be on the quality of performance by the staff and the group, not simply the quantity. The tactical, technical, physical, psychological is omnipresent. Psychology, for example, you can't just simply plug and play psychology. You can't have a player who is struggling with confidence or is being bullied in the locker room, having the same thing happen to him in the cafeteria or the canteen, and then expect 20 minutes in a dark room once a week with a psychologist to fix it. This is where this model is a holistic model that is omnipresent. We must start with the game model and work backwards. One of the failings that I made initially was I started with GPS. I started with 50 metrics every second, started with heart rate variability, and tried to work forwards to identify who was playing well, who wasn't. Start with the game model, identify the problems, and work backwards to choosing the right technology from your toolbox or the right approach from your toolbox. Use data in context. Unless the data and information has been used in the moment and understood clearly in the moment, it's not going to have relevance. The person must come before the athlete. Remember this, that for every 2 hours practice, there's 22 hours away from you, which is going to have a greater impact on their lifestyle and on their performance. Issues that players will have on the court generally have started off the field. They've started off the court, they've started at home, their social, their lifestyle, their welfare issues. Just because you don't assess them doesn't mean that they don't have an impact. So having a holistic model of the player, monitoring and tracking those, even if it's only subjective, even if it's only qualitative, those things are critical to the sustainable success of the player. And the aim always is sustainable success. It's not short-term winning. Any coach can go to a team for 2 or 3 years, drive them hard, and have sudden success. But to have sustainable, continued success, you must look after people, and that should be the aim, not short-term winning. Thank you.